Hello, welcome. My name is Nolafis, and oh boy, here we go. I was honestly pushing off this video for a while. I knew it was going to be a bigger one, and scenery is my weakest point, but I think it's a lot of builders' weakest point. Lately, I feel like I have a better grasp on what makes great scenery. My execution might leave something to be desired, but the ideas are there. The reason I'm making this video isn't because I think I'm so great at making maps look fantastic, it's because there really is just a lack of resources and I'm trying to do my part. It took me a while to figure these things out, so I hope this can speed up your learning process and then you can help me. Also, a little warning before we get started. Console players are at a severe disadvantage when it comes to scenery, unfortunately. Without access to ghost blocks or the ability to place off the grid, there's going to be several layers of detail PC players are going to be able to do that console players just can't. Don't get too discouraged, there's still plenty you can do, but you might have to be a bit more creative to work around those limitations. Just wanted to get that out there. I know not everything I'll say in this video is applicable to console players, but most of it will be. Okay, on to the video. If you're like me, once you built a couple routes, you wanted to make one of them look nice. You start to explore what blocks you can use and end up with something like this. The map gets finished and you push it into map review. You're proud of creating something that looks pretty good, but a little nervous as your map gets closer to the front of the queue. Finally, your map is here, people are driving it, and no one is saying anything. The 3 minutes are up, players are voting, and still the chat box remains empty. Just as the server is about to flip onto the next map, someone types a message. Map is alright, scenery is a bit boring. And that was pretty much my experience in map review for the first few months. No matter what I did, what I added, there was always the comment that my scenery lacked detail. It left me frustrated because I didn't really know where to go. If there's a problem with the route, I can fix that. But if someone just says to add more scenery, where? How? What do I even do? Even posting my map on dedicated feedback places, I rarely got any critique on the scenery. So I looked at what better builders were doing, compared it to my own, and came up with these 3 elements. I guess you could call them the pillars of good scenery, but that seems a little strong. Each of these ideas lean on each other, so maybe something lighter, like a tent or teepee or something. Anyway, the elements are based on what the scenery is trying to accomplish. Obviously, you're trying to make the map look good, but that's not all scenery should do. Good scenery should help guide the player through the map, whether it's helping players judge corners, anticipate where the route is heading next, or breaking the map up into sections. So keep that in mind when I'm talking about these elements. The first of which is variety. Variety is important for a few reasons. When people tell you to add detail, this is probably what they're talking about. Variety means that as the player drives through the track, they should be looking at different types of blocks. In the example I made for this video, the scenery fails in that regard. All the player is looking at are the grass scenery blocks, trees, and wooden supports. Nothing really stands out, so the entire map just falls flat. The other reason to add variety is to help the player memorize the route. It's hard to remember what comes next when everything looks the same. This can apply to block combinations as well as colors and textures. By adding different scenery elements, players can then remember that the big turn happens right after the grass overhang. Instead of relying on flat-out memorization, something I'm awful at. Please don't make me do that. For a very good example of what I'm talking about, check out Tona, Nightwolf, and Ealipse's map, MTC Solstice. Some people may remember this as a special June 21st, 2022 track of the day. The reason I'm bringing it up is because this was an endurance map that was over 3 minutes long. Having a map that long for Cup of the Day would normally be a nightmare, but the scenery did a very good job of breaking up each section visibly. Certain elements were tied to certain zones, and even now, over a year later, I still remember to prepare for the pipe exit in the plastic cave. Despite the length, changing from zone to zone gave the player a sense of progression and reminded you that you're making progress. Now, not every map is going to be long enough to allow this many changes, but hopefully you get my point. It also helps with keeping the player engaged, as it's easy to tune out the scenery when it all looks the same. After all, you put all those hours into making your map look good, you should want the player to notice. And making sure that certain elements stand out can only do good things. Mostly. The second element is layers. Or another name could be depth. Basically, your scenery elements should be happening at various distances from the player. One could even say you need a variety of elevations, and we should all know how important variety is by now. In the example map, everything is happening at ground level. It might look filled when you're staring from above in the editor, but when the player drives your map, all the scenery elements are happening to the side. Besides the actual elevation changes in the route itself, the map literally falls flat. This can be improved by adding layers to what we have. This is accomplished by having some scenery elements closer to the player than others. It helps to add a sense of scale. A more deliberate approach would be to add a large structure on one side of the map, possibly visible from the start. As you drive the map, the structure gets closer and closer. If done well, it can add a lot to the intrigue of the first few runs, something to hold the player's interest while they get used to the map. One of my favorite examples is Striderin's map, the Evokers. It's a memorable map that was Track of the Day on May 4th, 2023. The reason why it stands out is because of these guys. They're scattered throughout the map and give an unsettling vibe as they're a great mix of cute and creepy. Several figures start out in the light fog for the start, but by the end you're driving right next to them. It gives a great sense of the scale of the map as well as lets the player in on what they can expect right away. A very good example of the distance layering I'm talking about. The layering shouldn't just be happening on the grand scale though, but can be applied to individual pieces as well. Instead of a tall tower of wooden blocks, replace some of those blocks with smaller or bigger pieces. Some signs or platform pieces wrapping up on the outside. Bits of pipe can also stick out, maybe even intersecting the track, creating an obstacle the player has to be aware of. And all of a sudden, that boring support structure has turned into something much more interesting to look at. Spread this across your map with some buildings further away, and the entire track becomes much more visually appealing. For an extreme example of this, load up SparklingW's map, Slick Circuit. It was Track of the Day on March 24th, 2023, and is absolutely packed with details and small layers. I don't think there's a plain block anywhere on this entire map. If I remember correctly, they said the scenery alone took over 100 hours, and I believe it. I'm not saying you need this level of commitment. I know I'll never do it, but you're not going to find a better example of the small layers I'm talking about. It also relates back to variety. Instead of a bunch of wooden blocks, each layer adds something different, making the entire map much more interesting. So it's important to add layers and have some variety, but when do you stop? The third element is theme. Basically, what is the theme of your map? It's nice to have some cohesion with everything that's happening. I'm not just talking about making your map look like it's in the desert or on a beach. Even if you're going for abstract structures, there should be some common elements throughout. These elements often include what kind of blocks you're building with and the color scheme. Looking at the example map again, what is the theme? The theme so far is just basic grass. There's not too much there, so it's a good idea to expand what that theme means. Adding more colors and structures to flesh out the rest of the map by adding variety and layers will go a long way. We don't want to go overboard though, we still have a theme to stick to. I know I said variety and layers were good things, but this is what's going to help you rein your ideas into something that's readable, or drivable in this case. It wouldn't make much sense to have your map start in a castle, move on to the desert, then a frozen lake being attacked by a UFO, only to finish back in the castle, but now there's a bear. The map wouldn't feel like an epic experience, only a collection of cool items you found on the item exchange. Now, there is an example of this done very well. Prof 10's map Worlds Collide 2 stands out as having several different themes. It was also Track of the Day on August 13th, 2022. One moment you're driving through a sci-fi base, then through a Nordic village that leads into a Greek temple where you end the map in a Japanese garden. It's not overwhelming because the theme is that you're exploring these different environments through portals that take you to each one, and each world is heavily themed and looks great, as is the norm for Prof. There's also a great use of layering to block off each section visually from the other so you don't see anything that doesn't belong. Overall, a great map that excels in what would normally be something very difficult to pull off. In the same vein, don't spam every color you can find. Most maps you'll see concentrate on one color with maybe a few complementary colors to help break things up. For a recent example of a map with a very strong color identity, take a look at Intax's map, Nexus. This map was Track of the Day on August 21st, 2023. The entire route just screams green, but it's broken up with black as the secondary color. The color scheme is very simple, and because of that, the entire map has a strong identity and everything is tied together very nicely, despite the scenery itself being quite abstract. It's a very nice looking map that's based on a very simple concept, and that's why I like it. There are several resources on the internet all about color theory, so don't be afraid to look it up. Later on, you can stretch what fits in a theme or color scheme, but starting out, it's best to keep it somewhat simple. I know I've said this before, and I think it rings true here. You have to know the rules before you can break them. I know I threw quite a few things at you, but there's one final concept. All three of these elements work together and rely on each other to support something that truly makes scenery stand out: immersion. When you're driving the maps I mentioned previously, you aren't just driving on a route, you're driving in that map. To get a better sense of what I mean, let's take another look at the beginner map. Yeah, the map looks nice on the surface, but past that, it's just some grass blocks and trees placed next to a route. There's no variety of elements, no layers to the elevation, and no real theme past basic grass. I'm not saying you can't use the grass blocks, I'm just saying that if you want your map to stand out, there has to be other elements added. So let's change out some of the hills for different types of grass blocks. That will give us some variety in the basic blocks. A few arches can help add that elevation change alongside a few towers and overhangs. This map really needs some layers to help bring it to life, and let's tie it all together with a splash of extra color. Remember, not too much, but I think adding black as a supporting color with the green and pink lights will add a lot of visual flair. There's a lot more detail I could add, but I have other maps I want to work on, so this'll do for now. Hopefully, as you're seeing the side-by-side comparison, you can tell which map is more visually appealing. All of the elements are working together to add to the immersion of the map. Keep in mind that in the editor, you have a bird's eye view on what's going on. It's much easier to fill everything up when you're staring at the ground. Players don't get that. Half the screen is the sky, and that's a lot of room to go to waste. Look out for bald patches with little to no scenery along the route as well. I usually spot them on the corners at the edge of the map. Making sure that your scenery elements are keeping the player visually engaged throughout the route adds a ton to the immersion. It's not very exciting to round a corner of an otherwise great map to see nothing but the stadium for a moment. It might seem like a lot of nitpicking, but a lot of the immersion comes from focusing on these smaller details. Just remember my three basic elements, and you'll finally be driving in your map, not on it. Before I end the video, there's a few more points I quickly want to go over. I'm going to backtrack a little bit on my statement about bald patches. It's true that you want the player to be engaged, but it's also important not to overwhelm the player with too much visual noise. Sometimes it's better to hold back and let the map breathe for a bit. The best scenery designers know where to put the detail for the biggest impact and where to relax. If everything stands out, then nothing will. I touched on it a little bit earlier on, but it's very important that the scenery adds to the track and helps with the readability. Unless you're specifically going for fake outs, scenery that's in the way or confusing just annoys the player. I've played more than a few maps on map review where the builder included fake routes for scenery, but didn't make it clear enough that they're fake and half the lobby drives into it. Not the best, especially when you're going for track of the day. If you join map review, pay attention to how others are driving your map. If players are getting lost or confused, that's a sign that something went wrong. It could mean there's too little scenery or too much. Try out a few different things and see what works best for your map. Which brings me to my final tip: experiment. Sometimes you don't know if something will turn out cool or bland. The only way to tell is by just trying to build it and seeing what you think. I've had routes that have seen several themes before I finally settled on one. We're all learning, and the best way to learn is to just do it and see what happens. So don't be afraid to go for it. You might just love it. And pouring hours into your scenery for other players to actually compliment your work feels amazing. I feel like I've shared quite a bit on what makes good scenery, but I haven't shared what's a good starting point. Oftentimes, that's the hardest part. If you're stuck on even knowing what to do, here's what I did. Think of a map that you really like the scenery of and look into what blocks they use to achieve that look. Take note of the colors, items, and where they're oriented in the player's typical vision. Try to pinpoint why you like that scenery specifically and see what you can do to replicate it. Don't steal. especially copying/pasting, that's not going to get you very far in both skill and community reputation. But there's nothing wrong with applying a scenery style to your map, especially when you're learning. Worst case scenario, if you really took a lot of inspiration, then credit the original map somewhere in yours. The most important part, though, is building everything yourself. That's the key that will eventually get you to a spot where you can think of and execute your own ideas. When starting out, I would also stick with the vanilla items. It's fine to go and get a specific custom item you're looking for, but overly relying on stuff you downloaded on TMX might not be that good of an idea. The main reason is that it's important to understand what you're capable of in the base editor and building your skills in there. The other, more practical reason is that stuffing your map with tons of custom items is a very easy way to get your map over the 6 megabyte limit. In case you don't know, there is a cutoff of 6 megabytes for online rooms, including Track of the Day. The file size limit doesn't apply to offline and solo modes as well as custom servers, but you have to keep it in mind if you're building for Track of the Day. Another reason to not go too hard with the custom items is that it could cause some shadow issues on the items themselves, which can detract from the overall look of your map. So take a look at some maps with great scenery, see what they do, and test if you can capture a bit of that magic. Before you know it, you'll start having great ideas of your own. And that's pretty much everything I can think of when it comes to scenery. Hopefully you were able to learn something from my struggles. I've been a bit frustrated in the past about the complete lack of resources when it comes to this topic, so here's my contribution. Remember that block variety goes a long way, have elements that are close to the player as well as far away, and tie it all together with a theme or color scheme. Don't go overboard, sometimes you need to let the scenery breathe, and don't be afraid to just go for it. Try something out. Worst case scenario, you know better for next time. If you have any more tips and tricks, make sure to drop them in the comments below. I read every comment, so I'll be answering questions as well. Be sure to share the video with someone you think could use the tips, and if you want to join me on my mapping journey to finally become a decent Trackmania mapper, be sure to hit that subscribe button. My last video did really well, and I would just like to say welcome to everyone. It's been a lot of fun to go through the video comments and say hi to those of you who recognize me in map review. I really appreciate the support. I have a lot more video ideas to make, but since that'll be a while, I hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you so much for watching, and if you'll excuse me, I still have a couple hundred hours of scenery ahead of me before I'm done with my 15-second tech mini. Bye!